A half-dozen police cars crowded the gravel driveway, their headlights lighting up a row of trees. The gnarled shadows they threw against the walls of the farmhouse swayed gently in the breeze. I pulled my hair back into a ponytail as I stepped over a line of yellow police tape. I didn't want to be accused of contaminating any evidence. A young officer eyed me suspiciously as I approached the house, but he let me pass through the front door. He knew why I was there. I found Jack's corpse in the upstairs bedroom, the blood from his self-inflicted gunshot wound still wet and sticky. Detective Marston, a thin, balding man, stood in the corner of the room, writing something in a notebook. "Hello, Jane," he said as I stepped through the doorway. "I'm surprised you didn't beat me here." I ignored the comment, squatting down near Jack's body. Most of his head was missing, and a thick iron scent hung in the air. The old man wore a pair of blue overalls, now spackled with blood. A piece of paper poked out of his chest pocket. I shot a look over my shoulder at Detective Marston. "You mind?" I asked. "Be my guest." I pulled out the paper and unfolded it delicately. There were a few words written in a shaky hand. It read, "It keeps getting closer. It keeps coming closer." I took a picture of the note with my phone before handing it over to the detective for him to read. He read it over a few more times, then paused. I knew he wanted to ask me about it, even if he hated that he needed me. "You've got to have some kind of explanation of this for me," he said. I did, but Marston didn't need to know what my guess was. I'd been working for 3 months on these suicides, and I'd finally managed to win his trust. I wasn't about to blow all my credibility on a guess about have him questioning my sanity. Instead, I shot a look down the hallway. "Maybe," I said. "I've got a few questions first. All the mirrors in the house are broken, I assume." "Just like the other cases, yeah," Marston said. "Anything that can show a reflection is either broken or thrown out." "Who found him?" "I found the body myself. You guessed that he'd be the next to go, so I decided to drive out here and check on him." I swung my head at the sound of crunching gravel. A car came to a stop in front of the house. The headlights flicked off, and a girl stepped out, her hands covering her mouth. She looked to be around 20 years old. I shot a questioning look at Marston. "It's Olivia, his granddaughter," he said. "She's the only one left alive in his family. We called her a half hour ago." He stared at me, his eyes hard. "Is she gonna be next?" I shut my eyes and rubbed my forehead. "Yeah, probably." Marston cursed. I handed him a business card. "If you wrote anything else down, please let me know." He took the card with a grunt, stuffing it into his back pocket. I left the room and made my way out of the house and down the driveway. I stopped in front of the girl and extended my hand. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. "My name is Jane. I'm a private investigator working on this case." Olivia's eyes hardened, and she didn't take my hand. "I don't have anything to say to a reporter." "I'm not a reporter." I paused, gathering my resolve. "And if you don't come with me, I think you're going to die like the rest of your family." Her eyes widened. Whatever's causing these suicides is spreading," I said. "Spreading to friends and family of the victims. First it was your aunt, then your cousin, and now your grandpa. You're the last one. It might already be too late, but it's possible I can help you." She looked from me to the farmhouse over my shoulder, suddenly looking as if she wanted to cry. "Okay, what should I do?" "Come with me," I said. She paused for another moment before nodding, and we walked over to my car. "Olivia," I said. "Yeah?" "Don't look at any mirrors, on my car or otherwise." "Why?" "Just don't. Trust me." She stared at me as if I was crazy, but when she saw I was serious, she agreed. I drove towards the road, gravel crunching under my tires. The first few minutes of the drive passed in silence. Olivia took a deep breath, then turned to look at me. "So, what's going to happen to me?" "First, I'll tell you what I know, and then what I guess," I said, running over the details in my mind. "The pattern for each victim is the same. According to their friends and family, victims start by showing erratic and paranoid behavior." "Grandpa Jack was the same," Olivia said, "ever since he found my aunt's body." I nodded. "Their paranoid behavior is always followed by their breaking or covering of all reflective surfaces. Suicide comes next. The next victim is usually a close friend or family member, typically in the same household. They begin to show the same paranoid symptoms, and they commit suicide soon after, and the psychosis spreads again." "If that's what you know," she said, "what do you guess?" I swallowed hard. I don't think that this is the work of a serial killer. Each method of suicide is different, and I don't know of any drugs or poison that can cause a specific kind of psychosis in victims ranging from teenagers to retirees. I shook my head. I probably should have dismissed that possibility a long time ago. If not a serial killer, then what? I said, trailing off as we reached my apartment. I paused to park and walk up the flight of stairs to my door, locking the deadbolt behind us for all the good it'd do. Then what? She asked again. I walked to my home office and pulled out a folder. I followed up on nearly 30 deaths over the past 3 months, I said. Some of them left suicide notes. I pulled out the pictures I'd taken from the crime scenes. Most of the notes were short, and all were disjointed and confusing. I handed them to her one at a time. I saw it reflected in Marge's eyes. Even her eyes aren't safe. The next one read, I can't sleep. It'll be watching me. The next one, the fingers. The next one, it was in my rearview mirror today. It's almost touching me. Olivia continued to flip through the suicide notes, her expression growing more and more disturbed. I finally pulled out my phone and showed her the note her grandfather had written. It keeps getting closer. It keeps coming closer. Was this from my grandpa? Olivia asked, her voice choked. Yes. And like I said, I think you're next, I said. She stared at me in horror. What do I do? Every victim broke their mirrors, and several mentioned reflections in their suicide notes. That means it's for the best if you avoid them. I'll cover the one hanging in my bathroom. You should also give me your phone. The black screen has a reflection, and I don't want to take any chances. She nodded numbly. I took down my bathroom mirror and set it in the corner of my living room before covering it with a blanket. You can sleep on the couch. We'll talk more tomorrow. It was hard to sleep that night. My mind was flooded with the images of the brutal suicides I'd investigated over the past months. Olivia was a rare opportunity. I had control over a victim before psychosis set in. Maybe I could save her. Maybe. The next morning, I woke up and found Olivia sitting on my couch, staring out into space. Her head swiveled at me. I was afraid I'd see violence or fear in her eyes. Instead, I just saw intensity. I need to look in the mirror, she said. Why? I asked. Whatever the others saw was enough to basically break their minds. It could kill you. I need to know. You can cover it up once I see it. I almost rejected the idea, but my curiosity got the better of me. Would I see something in the reflection behind her? Was one exposure enough to kill her? Okay, I said, bringing my still-covered mirror out from the corner. I grabbed the corner and slowly lifted the blanket, watching Olivia's face for any reaction. She stared at the mirror intently until the blanket was pulled away. Then she shook her head and looked at me. I don't see anything. Really? I said, my mind racing. Maybe it had jumped to a neighbor instead. Maybe Jack had a bowling friend or something. Maybe... My phone rang, the chirp making me jump. I looked at the display. It was Detective Marston. Detective, I said, you have any new information for me? I see it, he said, his voice trembling. What? I asked, my face suddenly cold. I broke the mirror so I wouldn't see it anymore, but it's still reflected in the shards. Jane, please help me. You said you had a guess. Why didn't you tell me about this? Oh, I thought about it again. If I look in the bathroom, I'll see it. Even my phone has a... His phone cut off, with the sound of the phone hitting the floor. Marston, I shouted. Marston, I'm coming. I hung up and turned to Olivia. I was wrong, I said. It wasn't you. It's a detective. But there still might be time. I ran down to my car, surprised that Olivia was running down the steps behind me. We sped across town, Olivia dialing the police, while I snaked down several windy country roads. I reached Marston's house, told Olivia to stay in the car, and ran up the steps to his front door. It was unlocked. Marston lay inside the bath. Blood spattered the white tiles. A piece of shattered mirror hung limply in one hand. He'd taken it to his own neck. I looked away, doing my best to choke down the vomit that rose in my throat. Then he gasped, his eyes flicking open. I didn't even know him, he said, his voice raspy and gurgling. I just found the body. That was all. He trailed off, blood choking off his words. His head slumped forward, a few drops flicking off his nose. I leaned against the wall of the bathroom, trying to control my breathing. It was the most gruesome thing I'd ever seen. Then, I slowly looked to my left. His medicine cabinet still hung on the wall. Its mirror had been shattered in the center, long cracks surrounding a central point. I saw myself reflected 24 times in the individual shards. I thought back through all the cases, all the victims, family members, friends, neighbors. They weren't just close to the victim. Each of them had found the victim's bodies. I looked at Marston's now lifeless body, then looked back up to the mirror. The mirror swung, changing my view from myself to the view of the kitchen. A figure stood there, reflected 24 times in the shards. It was impossible to get a good view due to the damage, but it was a creature with eyes sunken deep into its skull. Its hands had long, gnarled fingers, and it was staring at me. I thought Marston's body was the worst thing I'd ever seen, but this was far, far worse. I slammed my palms over my eyes, the broken image of the creature burning into my brain like a hot iron. I vomited onto the tiles before running for the front door, with my hands still clamped firmly onto my face. My foot hit the top step and twisted, and I fell down the rest of them in a tangled heap. Blood oozed from the scrapes on my elbows, knees, and forehead, but I didn't remove my hands from my eyes. I lay in the grass, the warm sun on my face, and I wished for nothing more than the will to claw my own eyes out. That thing was following me. I had no doubt. I had no doubt it was getting closer to me. The thought of seeing it again forced me onto my side, where I vomited again. "Jane," Olivia said, scrambling over to my side. "Jane, what happened?" "You're not next, Olivia," I said, my voice little more than a whisper. "I'm next." The only truly negative memories I have of my early childhood are a series of nightmares involving a character I named Mr. Trilby. I remember seeing his face outside my window when I was very young. It's been years, but a few details always stick out in my mind. He always wore the same Trilby hat, he always spoke with a wide grin, and tears were constantly running down his face. The rest is fuzzy. I know he was always inviting me to join him out in the woods, luring me with a candy and a train ride. Kids have lots of crazy nightmares, though. I put it out of my mind and moved on with my life. My wife and I had our first daughter 4 years ago, and it's been amazing to watch her slowly learn to do, well, everything. That's why what she said last night after dinner scared me so bad. "Hey, Daddy and Mommy," she said. "Yeah," I said, laying on the couch next to my wife and scrolling on my phone absent-mindedly. "You said not to talk with strangers, right?" My wife sat up. "That's exactly right. Did a stranger try and talk with you?" She nodded. "Last night, a stranger outside my window wanted to show me a train and gave me some candy." Memories from my own childhood flooded my brain. I'd thought about them so much during my adolescence that the edges of the memories were worn down and faded. The top hat, the smile, the dripping tears. "Well, you did exactly the right thing," my wife said. "Don't talk with any strangers." My daughter's bedroom was on the second floor of our house. There was nothing, save a ladder, that could have reached her bedroom. But I still had to ask. "What did he look like, honey?" "He had a hat on, and he was smiling, but he must have been hurt because he was crying." I stiffened. "Well, like Mommy said, always say no. You did good, honey." I got up and walked into my study and pulled out my phone. I needed to know if my mom had told my daughter about my nightmares. It was the only explanation. "Hey, Justin," my mom said. "How are things?" "Good," I said. "Hey, listen, Mom. Do you remember those nightmares I had when I was a kid? The ones with the guy outside my window?" "Of course," she said with a laugh. "I think you're still dealing with that trauma." "Did you tell Anna about those?" "No," she said. "No, I haven't even thought about that in years." "Yeah, I figured," I said, looking back into the living room at my wife and daughter. "And, Mom, this is gonna sound strange. You're sure I was having nightmares, right?" "How could it not be?" she asked. "A crying man asking you to play trains in the woods? Besides, your bedroom was on the second floor. There's no way some weirdo could have even reached you." "Right," I said. "Well, I'll talk with you later, Mom." I had to know. My wife was crazy, but I set up a sleeping pad out in the woods with a view of my daughter's window. I had to know whether or not I was crazy. I listened to music and audiobooks as I waited for the night to pass, but I found myself fighting the urge to drift off to sleep. I jerked awake, what felt like just a moment later, rubbed at my eyes, and checked the time on my watch. It displayed 3 a.m. exactly. I rolled onto my side and looked up at my house. A figure stood outside my daughter's window. I scrambled to my feet and ran out the woods onto my lawn. "Hey, get away from there!" All the blood drained from my face as the figure turned to look at me. I was right. The only way to get up to my daughter's window would have been to use a ladder, at least for a human person. Mr. Trilby was not human. He stood in the grass beside the house, on legs that were at least 10 feet tall. His arms were lanky, hanging down to his sides. My childhood memories of his face were worn down and faded, but seeing him again sharpened them to a razor point. His face was white, bore a wide toothy grin, and was crisscrossed by rows of tears dripping down his face. "Hello, Justin," he said with a quivering voice. He began walking towards me with steps that brought his knees almost to his chest. His smile never wavered. I screamed, fell onto my back, and skittered backwards on the grass. He gave a high laugh, stepped over me, and disappeared into the woods. I called the police, for all the good it would do, and told them someone had been outside my daughter's window. They sent a patrol car, took my statement, and then left. I'm inside my daughter's room now, but I can't bring myself to stop staring out the window, at the woods. I've been an avid hiker for most of my life. Growing up in Colorado means that I'm still finding new places to explore, even after 20 years of weekly expeditions. A few days ago, my friend Jane approached me. We'd explored several canyons and mountains together, and I knew her as an extremely competent climber. Jane was shaken up. She told me that she'd been scrolling around on Google Maps and found a promising canyon to explore. She'd gone there with her dog to check it out. Apparently, the canyon itself was beautiful, perfect for hiking. But at the end of it, she'd found something extremely odd. It was a broken dam that looked to be centuries old. It was made out of rough stones linked together with concrete. She said it had to have been 200 feet tall at the very least. I said that it sounded amazing, but she cut me off. This dam felt wrong, she said. I'm not superstitious, but this thing gave off a vibe that I could almost taste in the air. She pointed to her dog. Major was freaking out too. I was more than a little intrigued. I wasn't the superstitious type, so her description caught my imagination. I found myself thinking about it over and over during the following days. I finally asked her to send me the address of a road near the opening of the canyon so I could explore it for myself. The start of my hike up the canyon was perfect. It was early afternoon in the Colorado spring, which meant that the heat of the day was more than countered by a cool breeze. The hike itself was fairly easy, though I did have to scramble up a few sets of rocks that blocked the path. Then, I saw it. A large, broken structure of rough stone dominated the canyon before me. The left side of the wall was all but broken away, though the right was still intact enough for me to see that Jane was right. It had to have been a dam 100 years back. The ruins towered over the canyon like the remnants of the Tower of Babel. Even the jagged remains of the structure seemed to be pointing to the late afternoon sun. That's when I noticed that everything was still. As I'd been hiking, the wind had constantly rustled the tall grass. The occasional bird would chirp, and I'd even swatted the occasional bug, though they were rare at this part of Colorado. But now, I licked a finger and held it out to feel for the wind direction. Nothing. The canyon was eerily, completely still. I approached the dam, jarringly aware of every noise I made, from the crunch of rocks under my feet to even small things like the material of my shorts rubbing together. My small sounds amplified to fill the deafening silence that swept the canyon. Jane was right about another thing, too. The dam was wrong somehow. Everything about it made my stomach tighten with anxiety. But despite the feeling, it was also somehow magnetic. It drew me closer. I climbed the hillside, approaching the bottom of the stone structure. Then, just above the ground, I saw it. A tunnel carved into the stone and rock. I stared into its black maw. The fear and anxiety in my gut increased, but I was shocked to find myself walking closer. The tunnel extended back into the darkness underground for as far as I could see. You're being ridiculous, I told myself. Jane's stories are filling your head and you're doing the rest yourself. There's nothing wrong with this tunnel. In fact, there may be something cool to discover on the other end. I nodded, set my teeth, and crawled up into the tunnel. I had to crawl on my hands and knees, but that wasn't an issue. I've got some experience caving, and this was far more forgiving than that. At least, that's what I told myself, as my instincts screamed at me to turn around. I paused, before continuing crawling into the tunnel for another dozen feet or so. That's when I heard whispers coming from deeper in the tunnel. I couldn't hear what they were saying perfectly, but there were at least 3 or 4 voices, each talking to me. They were trying to convince me to come deeper into the tunnel. That's when I finally decided to listen to what my instincts, stomach, and goosebumps were telling me. Turning around was painfully slow in the cramped space. I crawled towards sunlight, trying to ignore the fact that the whispers were clearly getting louder and closer. Then a freezing cold hand wrapped around my right ankle. I jerked, kicking it away and scrambling back down the tunnel, scraping my knees and palms raw. I hit the grass on the ground outside hard and rolled away before turning and staring back up at the tunnel. I saw nothing but black. I turned and ran back up the canyon, moving as fast as I dared. After a half hour or so of jogging, I had made it back to my car. I need to do some more research on this dam. If I find anything else out, I'll update you here. My parents live high up in the mountains, a little to the west of Denver. Last weekend, my fiancée Rachel and I drove up to their house for dinner. I go to school in Colorado Springs, which means I normally drive east out of the mountains before heading south on the highway towards my apartment. But this time, when I put my address into the GPS, I noticed there was a slightly faster route that ran back and forth while staying in the mountains. After talking it over with Rachel, we decided to follow this new path. The moon was full, the car had plenty of gas, and we were in an adventurous mood. The beginning of the drive passed without incident. I knew most of the roads near my parents' place, and the full moon washed everything out with a pale, colorless light that made following the signs easy. The road took us deep into the mountains, and soon the winding path was rough and bumpy from lack of use. We'd been driving for about a half hour when Rachel turned on the radio. At first, everything was static. "Well, we're in the mountains," I said. "Reception's gonna be rough out here." Rachel didn't answer, instead continuing to turn the knob in search of a new station. She stopped the dial when she heard a voice. At first, I thought it was one of those Christian radio stations that play out in the country. You know, the kind that have audio sermons constantly playing. But as I listened, I realized it was something more like a public service announcement. The voice on the radio was noticeably deep. "I repeat, all cars driving on Pikes Lane. There is a serious rock slide blocking the road near Adler's Junction. We recommend that all drivers take Manitou Drive as a detour." I looked down at my GPS and saw that we were driving on Pikes Lane, then scrolled along the road until I found a road marked Manitou Drive. "Huh," I said. "Should we just turn around?" Rachel asked. "We've already been driving for half an hour. It'd mean adding an hour till we get home." I tapped the screen to add the turn onto my GPS. "Let's see how long this detour is." I turned right onto Manitou Drive. It wound back and forth down into a valley. After another 10 minutes or so, we arrived in the small town. There didn't appear to be any other exit outside of the lone road that had carried us there. The only light within 100 feet came from a rundown gas station. My phone didn't have any service, so I pulled into a parking space and walked inside, hoping to get directions for the rest of the detour. The man behind the counter was in his late 50s and smelled horrible. Not just the smell of body odor, but of something worse, like he'd been working with rotting animals a few minutes back. "Hey," I said, "we were driving and got detoured through this town. Is there a way south through here? We're just trying to get down to Colorado Springs." An excited smile spread across the man's face. "Oh yeah," he said. "Just keep driving through town." His voice was somehow familiar, but I was too distracted by the smell to give it much thought. I thanked him for the information, returned to my car, and set off down the road with Rachel. "My friends," the radio crackled, "it is time. We gather at the square." I looked up at Rachel. She was staring at the radio with a concerned expression. "Was that the same guy that announced the rock slide?" "Sounded like it," I said. I continued driving through town, following the path he'd laid out. It came to a dead end at a bunch of trailers. I tried to check the map on my phone, but I still had no service. "Well, I guess we have to go back," I said. We were driving back along the winding roads through the town when my headlights illuminated something blocking the road. I pulled my car to a stop, staring out at what was clearly a tied-up woman laying on the ground. I said. "Hey," Rachel said, "drive fast." I turned to follow her eyes. No less than 40 dark figures emerged from behind a rundown building surrounding us. They were holding candles, and they were running for our car. I slammed my foot down on the gas, narrowly avoiding the woman tied up, and sped off down the road. The radio crackled to life again. "Come back. Join our celebration." I realized where I'd recognized it. It was the same man in the gas station. The same man who'd announced the rock slide and brought us into the town. I didn't stop driving until I reached my parents' place. But I looked up some news articles and found several that mentioned drivers going missing near the town we'd driven through. Recently, I've been feeling tired all the time, so I downloaded one of those apps that's supposed to track your sleep schedule. The app automatically records audio if you snore, or if you're turning over in your bed, that sort of thing. It's pretty smart. It has automatic detection of the kind of noise that you're making. I set it up and slept with it for a few nights. Yesterday, I looked through the audio files and began listening to see if there was something I could change to get a better night's sleep. The first recordings were exactly what you'd expect. A few sounds of me turning over in my bed, the occasional snore, and the occasional groan or mutter. It was only the last few nights that began to be strange. There were a few recordings labeled sleep talking. Each recording had a small transcription button below it. Apparently, the app ran the recording through some kind of speech-to-text generator. I opened the transcript and found the following message: unable to transcribe sleep talking. So I tapped the playback button and listened closely. Instead of the normal grunts or single words I sometimes said, there was a strange wet sucking sound. I put in earbuds and turned up the volume. It honestly reminded me of the sound a person would make when they take a deep breath through their nose while smelling fresh bread, or cookies, but somehow wetter. It didn't sound like something I was capable of producing. The playback said that it had been taken at 2:33 a.m. The following 2 nights also had recordings with the same sleep-talking titles. Each of them had also been taken at 2:33 a.m. I listened to both of them and heard the same wet slurping sound. At this point, I was more than a little freaked out. I live alone and couldn't think of an even moderately likely explanation for what I'd recorded. I decided to stay up and get to the bottom of the noise. If my vents or phone was making a strange sound at 2:33 a.m. each night, I wanted to be awake for it. I lay in bed, watching YouTube videos until around 2:15 a.m., then set my phone down to wait the last little bit in the darkness. Laying in my bed in the pitch black was extremely unnerving. I had the overpowering sensation that something was watching me, though I told myself that I'd be feeling that regardless of what was actually happening. I stared at the ceiling and told myself that surely 2:33 had already passed. Surely I was laying in the dark around 2:40 and being ridiculous. Then my door opened. I froze. Something moved into my room. It made the same wet breathing sound I'd heard before. I immediately began coughing and rolled over in my bed, hoping whatever it was would leave. It immediately moved backwards out of my door. I lay there for a few moments, trying to convince myself that I'd made up whatever I'd heard. Then I turned to look at my bedroom door, the door I always keep firmly shut while I sleep. It was hanging open. I swung my legs out, grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed in my right hand, and held out my phone's light in my left. Then I turned on my bedroom light and began walking through my house. I walked through the hallway to my kitchen, flipped on the light, and froze. A black figure sat, halfway obscured, inside my laundry room. It had skin so black it was almost invisible, but one of its white eyes was staring at me. I scrambled back to my room, slammed the door shut, and called the police, trying not to hyperventilate while I waited for them to arrive. They're still searching my house right now, but they say they haven't found evidence of anything. I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight, but it won't be here.